11 months after he ended our engagement, I sat across an interview table from the man who once told me I'd never make it without him. He didn't recognize me at first, not because I looked that different, though I did. He didn't recognize me because in his mind, I was still the woman he'd left behind in a 2-bedroom apartment with half the furniture and none of the savings. He wasn't expecting to see me on the other side of a hiring panel, holding his resume, deciding whether he'd get a job at the company I now help run. I want to back up because you need the whole story to understand what that moment actually meant. 3 years earlier, this man had put a ring on my finger in front of 40 of our closest friends and family. 14 months after that, he took it back, told me I was too much to build a future with, and moved a new woman into an apartment 11 minutes from the one we used to share, before the paint had even dried on the for rent sign outside our old place. He thought he was trading up. He thought I'd spend the next few years quietly falling apart while he posted vacation photos with someone new. Instead, I did something he never saw coming, and by the time he sat down across from me in that interview room, he had absolutely no idea just how far, how completely, and how permanently I had left him behind. Stick with me, because the way I found out he'd been lying to me for months is only the beginning. What happened after that is the part that actually changes everything. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're new here, I tell true stories about betrayal, growth, and the kind of quiet revenge that doesn't need to be loud to be devastating. Before we dive in, if you believe the best comeback is living well, hit that subscribe button now because this story is exactly what you came here for. And I promise you, this gets so much worse before it gets better. There's a discovery about halfway through that changes the entire way I understood our 5 years together, so stick with me. Let's go back to the beginning. I'll call myself Emma for this story, and I'll call him Jared. Names changed, obviously, but everything that happened is real. I met Jared when I was 26 at a coworker's rooftop birthday party. He had this effortless confidence that pulled a room toward him without him ever seeming to try. He worked in commercial real estate, ambitious, always talking about the next deal, the next promotion, the next 5-year plan. I was building my own career at the time, marketing coordinator at a mid-sized agency, hungry, hardworking, still figuring out exactly what I wanted. Jared made me feel like I'd already arrived just by being chosen by him. I know how that sounds now. I didn't see it that way then. We dated for 2 years before he proposed on a trip to the coast, down on one knee at sunset, the whole scene you'd expect from a movie. I said yes without a second of hesitation. I remember calling my mom that night, crying happy tears, telling her I'd finally found my person. For a while, it really did feel that way. Here's the part I need you to really sit with, because this is where the hindsight comes in. Red flag number 1. About 8 months into our engagement, Jared got a big promotion, regional director. More money, more travel, more late nights closing deals. I was proud of him. I told everyone. What I didn't clock at the time was that his promotion came with a whole new circle of colleagues, and one of them, a woman named Brooke, started showing up in his stories a lot. Team lunches, happy hours, nothing that seemed out of place on its own. Red flag number 2, somewhere around month 10 of the engagement, Jared started encouraging me to slow down on my own career. Not cruelly, always framed as concern. You don't need to work this hard, babe. I've got us covered. Why stress about a promotion when we're about to build a life together? I remember feeling loved by that, taken care of. I didn't clock that it was also, quietly, making me more dependent on him, financially, professionally, emotionally. I actually turned down a promotion at my own agency during that stretch because Jared and I had talked about possibly relocating for his career, and it didn't feel worth the stress of taking on more responsibility somewhere I might be leaving anyway. I want you to remember that detail because it matters enormously later in this story. Red flag number 3. He started being weirdly generous in specific little ways that, looking back, feel almost like guilt payments. A spa day out of nowhere, a surprise dinner reservation, once an entire weekend trip to celebrate absolutely nothing, paid for entirely by him, insisting I not worry about splitting it for once. At the time, I thought, I am so lucky. Now I recognize that pattern for exactly what it usually is. I want to introduce my sister here because she matters a lot later. I'll call her Dana. Dana had never fully warmed up to Jared, and for the longest time, I chalked it up to sibling protectiveness. About 4 months before the engagement ended, Dana came to visit and watched Jared take a work call during our dinner, laugh a little too easily at whatever was said on the other end, then glance at me, almost checking whether I'd noticed. She waited until he left the table and said, "Who was that?" "Just work," I said. "He's been closing this big account with someone from the Denver office." Dana just looked at me and said, "Okay, just pay attention, all right?" I didn't pay attention, not the way I should have, because when you're planning a wedding, choosing a venue, picking out place settings, you're not exactly in the mindset to go looking for problems. You're building, and building makes you generous with your trust in exactly the moments you should be spending it more carefully. Then came the conversation that ended everything, and I still remember it almost word for word. It was a random Tuesday night. Jared came home from work quieter than usual, sat me down at our kitchen table, and told me he needed to talk. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he loved me, but he didn't think he could give me the future I deserved. He said, and this is the line that has stuck with me for years now, "You're an incredible person, Emma, but honestly, I think you're too much for me to build a life around." I sat there completely stunned. Too much? After putting my own career on hold for him? After being the one who canceled a promotion for our future together? Too much? I asked him if there was someone else. He looked me dead in the eye and said no. This is just about us. I need space to figure out who I am. I believed him completely. That's where the version of my life where I trusted this man ends, because 3 weeks later, one of my old coworkers sent me a screenshot that changed absolutely everything I thought I understood about those 5 years, and what I found out next made me realize the breakup wasn't the worst thing he'd done to me. It wasn't even close. Let's get into it. The screenshot was from Instagram, a photo of Jared and a woman I didn't recognize, arms around each other at a rooftop bar downtown, captioned with a single heart emoji. My old coworker had sent it with the message, "Isn't this the girl from his office? Wasn't sure if you'd seen this." I zoomed in. It was Brooke, the colleague from all those team lunches over the past year. I want to be honest about what I did next, because I think a lot of people watching this would recognize the impulse. I didn't message him immediately. I didn't scream, didn't throw anything, didn't even cry at first. I just sat there, completely still, doing math in my head. The photo was time-stamped from 2 nights after he'd ended our engagement. Fast. Suspiciously fast for someone who just told me he needed space to figure out who he was. So I did what I do best. I started digging. I went back through old photos on my own phone, cross-referencing dates against things I remembered, work trips, late nights, the exact week his big Denver deal supposedly closed. And that's when I found it. There was a company holiday party, 7 months before the engagement ended, where I distinctly remembered Jared introducing me to the new director from the Denver office, Brooke. I remembered it specifically because she'd complimented my dress and he'd seemed oddly eager to end the conversation and move us to another table. 7 months. Not 3 weeks. 7 months of overlap I never once suspected. I want to tell you about the why moment because everyone who's been through something like this asks it. Why would someone spend 7 months quietly building an exit while still planning a wedding with me? Why not just be honest the moment his feelings changed? I never got a fully satisfying answer to that. What I eventually pieced together through some very careful, very indirect conversations with mutual friends over the following weeks was something close to the truth. Jared had been unsure, stringing along both relationships, letting momentum keep our engagement moving forward because ending it felt harder than continuing to lie. He wasn't torn between two great options. He was avoiding a hard conversation for as long as he possibly could at my expense. Here's the first moment I truly could not believe. I remembered with a sick feeling in my stomach that surprise weekend trip he'd paid for to celebrate nothing, the one where he insisted I not worry about splitting the cost. I checked the dates against the photo timeline. That trip happened exactly 9 days after the holiday party where I'd met Brooke. That wasn't generosity. That was guilt dressed up as romance. The second moment, I remembered how hard he'd pushed me to slow down on my own career during that same stretch of months. "You don't need to work this hard. I've got us covered." At the time, it felt like love. Now I understood it completely differently. A man quietly building an exit doesn't want his soon-to-be ex financially independent and thriving on her own. He wants her comfortable, dependent, and easy to leave without consequence. I had turned down a promotion, put my ambitions on pause, all while he was using that exact stretch of time to build a life with someone else. The third moment, and this is the one that finally moved me from grief into something colder, I reached out to a mutual friend very carefully just to ask a general question about how Jared and Brooke had gotten together. She hesitated, then told me something I wasn't prepared for. Several people at his office had known for months. It wasn't exactly a secret in his professional circle, just a secret from me. An entire office full of people watching a man plan a wedding with me while quietly building a second life, and not one of them thought I deserved to know? That was the moment something in me hardened completely, because up until then, some small part of me had been holding on to the idea that maybe this was just a sudden, messy, falling out of love situation, painful but at least honest in its own way. Instead, I found out I'd spent the better part of a year being managed, handled, kept comfortable and unaware while decisions were made around me instead of with me. I remember exactly what I said out loud to my empty apartment that night. "Okay, if that's the game, fine, but I'm not playing it his way anymore." But what happened next I never saw coming, because the plan I built over the following weeks wasn't about getting him back, and it wasn't about petty payback either. It was about making absolutely sure that the version of my life he'd tried to shrink me into was the last version of me he ever got to see. Let's get into how I built it. I want to be clear about something before we go further. Nothing in this plan involved sabotaging Jared's job, his new relationship, or his reputation. I never contacted Brooke. I never posted anything vindictive. What I built instead was something much simpler and, honestly, much more devastating in the long run. I built myself deliberately and completely into someone he could never again convince was too much for anyone. The first person I called was Dana. I told her everything, the Instagram screenshot, the timeline, the 7 months of overlap, all of it. She didn't say, "I told you so," even though she absolutely could have. She just said, "Okay, what do you need first?" That's the kind of ally you want in a moment like this, someone who skips past the shock and gets straight to the useful question. Here's the actual plan Dana and I built together, and I'm walking you through it in detail because I think a lot of you are going to recognize pieces of your own story in it.
Step 1. Separate my finances and my future from his, completely and immediately. During the engagement, Jared and I had opened one small joint account for wedding expenses. I closed my half of it the same week I found out about Brooke, split what remained fairly, and never looked back.
More importantly, I requested my own credit report, something I'd honestly never bothered checking carefully before, and discovered Jared had added me as an authorized user on one of his credit cards months earlier for wedding purchases, a card that, it turned out, was carrying a balance considerably higher than he'd ever told me about. I had it removed within the week. That single move alone protected my credit score from a mess that had nothing to do with me. Step 2. Go back to my own career immediately and aggressively. Remember that promotion I'd turned down over a year earlier for our future? I called my old manager, explained I was in a very different place now, and asked if there was still room to grow at the agency. There was. I threw myself into that job the way I used to before I started shrinking myself to fit into someone else's plans. Step 3. Rebuild financially, not just emotionally. I want to be specific here because I think the specifics matter. I picked up freelance marketing consulting on the side, on top of my full-time role, purely to rebuild savings I'd let stagnate during 2 years of, "We don't need to worry about that, I've got us." Within about 8 months, I had not just replaced what I'd put on hold, I had exceeded it. Step 4. Get real support, not just cheerleading. I started seeing a therapist, specifically one who worked with clients recovering from relationships involving this kind of slow, quiet control. That was one of the best decisions I made in this entire process because it helped me understand something crucial. The plan wasn't just about proving Jared wrong. It was about making sure I never again mistook someone shrinking my ambitions for someone loving me. Step 5. Invest in myself the way he'd once discouraged me from doing. I finally took a professional certification course I'd talked about for years but never pursued because Jared always had a reason it wasn't the right time. I completed it in 4 months, working nights and weekends around my full-time job. Here's the near miss I want to tell you about, because it almost derailed everything emotionally, even though it had nothing to do with logistics. About 5 months after the breakup, a mutual friend invited me to a group dinner without mentioning that Jared and Brooke would also be there. I walked in completely unprepared, and there they were, sitting together, looking every bit the happy new couple. I remember standing in that doorway for what felt like an eternity, every instinct telling me to turn around and leave. I didn't leave. I sat down, made polite small talk, ordered a glass of wine I barely touched, and left within the hour, without giving either of them a single reaction to hold on to. It wasn't easy. It might have been one of the hardest things I did in this entire story, but walking out of that dinner with my composure fully intact taught me something Dana had been trying to tell me for months. The goal was never to make him regret it in the moment. The goal was to make sure that over time, there was nothing left for him to feel superior about. By month 10, my freelance consulting side work had grown into something bigger than I expected. I'd built a small but genuinely successful client roster of my own, and my old agency manager, impressed with both my full-time output and the caliber of freelance clients I'd quietly built, recommended me for an opening at a much larger firm she had contacts at, a regional marketing and business development company that, as it happened, handled several accounts in commercial real estate. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it becomes important very soon. I interviewed and I got the job, senior marketing strategist, a serious step up, with a clear path toward a director-level role within a couple of years. For the first time since the breakup, I wasn't just recovering, I was genuinely, measurably ahead of where I'd been before Jared ever entered my life. But what happened next I never saw coming, because the industry I'd landed in turned out to be a lot smaller than I expected,
and 11 months after the breakup, that overlap was about to bring Jared directly back into my life, in a room where, for the first time, I held every bit of the power. Let's get into how it actually played out. About a year into my new role, the firm I worked for landed a major expansion, a new division specifically focused on commercial real estate marketing partnerships, working directly with regional real estate firms on business development. Because of my growing track record, I was asked to sit on the hiring panel for several new positions on that team. I didn't think twice about it when I saw the stack of resumes for the final interview round. I was focused, professional, prepping questions the same way I always did. Then I got to the third resume in the stack. Jared's name, his photo, his work history, including the exact regional director title he'd been so proud of when we were together, except now listed underneath it a note about seeking new opportunities and a start date for that role that put its ending only 2 months earlier. I sat with that resume for a long moment before showing it to my 2 co-panelists, both of whom had no idea about my personal history with the candidate. I made a decision right there, one I still stand by completely. I disclosed it immediately. I told my manager and both co-panelists, plainly and professionally, that I had a prior personal relationship with this candidate, and I offered to recuse myself from his interview entirely if they felt it was a conflict. Here's the first moment I want you to really feel. My manager looked at his resume, looked at me, and said, "Honestly, given his qualifications on paper versus the other 2 finalists, I'd like your read on him specifically. You clearly know how he operates professionally in ways we don't. Are you comfortable staying on the panel and being completely objective?"
I said yes, and I meant it. Because at that point, 11 months in, I genuinely didn't need this moment to be about revenge. I needed it to be about doing my job well. The interview happened 2 days later. I walked into that conference room in a navy suit I'd bought with my own freelance earnings, hair done, portfolio in hand, completely composed. Jared walked in a few seconds after me, glanced at the panel, and did a visible double-take when he saw my face. He genuinely did not recognize me at first glance, not because I look wildly different, though I'd changed plenty in 11 months, but because the last version of me he'd seen was someone smaller, someone who'd put her promotion on hold for his future, someone he'd confidently told was too much to build a life around. He recovered quickly, professional smile back in place, and greeted the panel like nothing was unusual. But I watched something shift behind his eyes the moment he clocked exactly who I'd become. The interview itself was thorough, and I'll be completely honest with you. I asked him fair, professional questions, the exact same ones I'd asked every other candidate that week. No traps, no gotchas. I didn't need any. Here's the second moment I want you to really feel. About halfway through the interview, discussing his reasons for leaving his previous role, Jared gave an answer that was noticeably vague, something about wanting new challenges and outgrowing the previous position's scope. My co-panelist, who'd already done basic reference checks, gently pressed for specifics. It turned out, according to a reference we later confirmed, that his previous firm's real reason for parting ways involved exactly the kind of pattern I recognized instantly: over-promising to clients, cutting corners on follow-through, and a habit of taking credit for work his junior team members had actually done. I sat there listening to a man describe in vague corporate language the exact same behavior pattern I now recognized so clearly, the same instinct to shrink other people's contributions to make his own look bigger. After he left the room, my co-panelists and I discussed all 3 finalists honestly and thoroughly. Jared's technical experience was solid on paper, but between the vague answers about his departure, the weaker reference feedback compared to the other candidates, and a genuine, well-documented gap in the specific skill set the role actually required, the panel unanimously agreed he wasn't the strongest fit, not because of me, because of the actual qualifications in front of us. I didn't lobby against him. I didn't need to.
The job simply went to someone more qualified, and I happened to be one of 3 people in the room who decided that, fairly and professionally. The third moment I want you to really feel came about a week later. Jared reached out to me directly, my personal number, which he still had, with a message that started polite and
professional, thanking me for the interview opportunity and ended with something else entirely, an apology. Not a groveling one, but a real one, admitting that ending things the way he did and everything that led up to it was something he genuinely regretted handling so poorly. He also mentioned almost in passing that things with Brooke hadn't worked out, that the relationship he'd left me for had ended a few months earlier, quietly, without the fanfare that had once accompanied its starting. I read that message twice, and here's what struck me most. A year earlier, that message would have wrecked me for a week. I would have replayed every word, wondered what it meant, maybe even entertained the idea of talking things through. Instead, I felt something closer to simple, quiet closure. I wrote back one short, polite message, wishing him well professionally, thanking him again for his time, and nothing more. No reopening old wounds, no gloating, just a clean, complete ending, exactly the way I'd built the last 11 months to deliver. Here's the twist I promised you back at the beginning, the one that changes how you look at this whole story. A few months later, at an industry networking event, I ran into someone from Jared's old office, one of the people who, it turned out, had known about Brooke months before I did. She pulled me aside a little sheepishly and told me something I hadn't expected. After Jared and Brooke's relationship ended, several people at that office had started reevaluating exactly how Jared had operated during that whole period, quietly juggling 2 relationships, letting people around him carry an uncomfortable secret for months. Apparently, it had cost him more professional goodwill in that office than he ever realized at the time. She said almost word for word, "I don't think people trusted him quite the same way after they found out how he handled that whole situation with you. It's like once you see someone operate that way in one part of their life, you start wondering where else they cut corners." That confirmed something I'd already come to believe deeply by that point. The way someone treats the people who trust them isn't a separate category from the way they operate professionally, financially, or anywhere else. It's the same pattern, showing up everywhere, whether you're watching for it or not. By the time I sat back at my desk after that networking event, promoted now to associate director, running my own small but growing client portfolio, financially further ahead than I'd ever been during my entire engagement to Jared, I realized something that genuinely surprised me. I wasn't thinking about him at all anymore. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just not thinking about him, which honestly felt like the biggest win of the entire story. Looking back now, here's what I actually learned from all of this. Moving on fast isn't the same as moving on well. Jared moved into a new relationship within weeks of ending ours, and for a long time I mistook his speed for confidence, for certainty, for proof that he'd never really doubted his decision. What I understand now is that speed is often just avoidance wearing a nicer outfit. Real growth, the kind that actually lasts, almost never happens that fast. I also learned that the moment someone encourages you to shrink, your ambition, your career, your independence, dressed up as love and care, deserve a much closer look than I gave them at the time. Real love builds you up. It doesn't quietly make you smaller and call it protection. And I learned that the best response to being told you're too much isn't to become less. It's to become so completely, undeniably yourself that the people who once called you too much end up needing something from the very version of you they tried to shrink. If you made it this far, I want to know, what would you have done sitting across that interview table? Would you have recused yourself, or would you have wanted to be in that room exactly like I was? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of the best stories I've told on this channel started as comments from people just like you. If this story kept you watching all the way to the end, hit subscribe if you haven't already, because I've got plenty more stories just like this one, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.